from right to left, as everyone in the audience, we've got Marcus Deutsch, CEO of Fusion Sport, Paul Devlin, the head of high performance from the Brisbane Broncos. We've got Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Malloy, Senior Health Officer up at 3 Brigade in Townsville, and we have Aaron Allsop, the General Manager of High Performance at the newly formed Solomon Islands Sports Institute. So we have a vast range of individuals here, and if you guys can just go down the line, we're going to get a bit of just a self-intro, just 30 seconds, a little bit more about yourself so the crowd is familiar.
Interestingly, started my whole career at the QAS. I was kind of stumbling along in a human movements degree just because the partying was good and I was just passing and didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. And then this was back in '95 when the QAS was at Southbank. Was in the lab one day and Bo Hansen, elite rower, came in, destroyed himself on a maximal test, threw up everywhere, passed out, and I was like, that's really cool. And my grade suddenly jumped and went into a PhD in rugby. Spent 7 years in New Zealand then came back and kicked off Fusion. And the rest is history, as I say.
Yeah, so I played league and union, rugby league and rugby union around Europe, started in England, went over to France, did 3 years over at Munster in Ireland. 9 knee surgeries led to a career in strength and conditioning, to see if I could find a way to prevent them. A couple of reconstructions mixed in there and decided that strength and conditioning might be a nice pathway to me with a kind of focus on trying to prevent injury in the early years. That led me to multiple clubs in league and union in England, and then I came over to the Storm, a year there, and moved over to Parramatta Souths, and now up here at the Broncos. So.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So Sarah Malloy, I've served 17 years in the Australian Army. I think we're all connecting our microphones here. 17 years in the Australian Army, so graduated Royal Military College and went into the Medical Corps as an officer. I've been working in the 3rd Brigade for the last 3 years and working with the Human Performance Framework in North Queensland. So we sort of had the liberty of being able to conduct a trial for Army Headquarters on human performance, and it's been very exciting to be at the forefront of that within that North Queensland region.
My name is Aaron. I'm an Australian that now lives between 3 different countries in the Pacific. I'm very lucky that we have a home in Samoa, but currently doing some work in Solomon Islands, setting up their Sport and Leadership Institute and a bit of stuff with Vanuatu Olympic Committee as well. But I'm from Toowoomba originally, moved to Brisbane for a while when I was with the QAS and then moved to the Gold Coast. Was doing some work in allied health to get into medicine, and then I realised I didn't want to be in the sort of medical field because of the hours, and so pursued more in different areas in sport. And for basically the last 9 years, I've been working through the Pacifics and set up the high performance program in Papua New Guinea for 5.5 years, and then spent 9 months in Samoa doing consultant through the Pacific from there. So currently about to move full-time to Solomon Islands to set up their Sport and Leadership Institute.
So as the audience can see, we've got a wide variety of individuals with a vast experience. And what I wanted to touch on firstly was the main thing after somebody wins a championship or there's a real key milestone of success, they'll ask the coach what was the key to success, and the coach will most likely say culture. They'll say it was the culture that drove it. So I wanted to start there. As leaders in your space, what are some of the things that you do, maybe on a day-to-day basis? Maybe it's routine, maybe it's month-to-month check-ins, not too sure necessarily, but how do you go about cultivating culture inside of your organisation?
I think culture's heavily researched. Everybody wants to know how to influence it, and you're right, people quote it all the time, and essentially it's the way we do things within the organisation. I think, being at multiple teams, multiple successful teams, not so successful teams, I think really the people who influence the behaviours are your leaders generally. Sometimes you have good leaders, sometimes you don't. I think the key in successful teams is trying to make sure that the guys who influence, I was listening to Simon talk and looking at the kind of roster they've got there at the Crusaders, they've had such incredible success in what is a pretty tricky competition. And I look there and would expect that they've got really good leaders. They've got some really senior players in there, and when you've got a combination of senior players in your group who've got elite training behaviours, I think you tend to crunch out a decent culture. The challenge is more so when you haven't got those guys and when you're trying to develop them. And I think that's the secret really, is sometimes I've just come back from a trip in the US, and one of the NFL franchises I visited, I went specifically because they've got a reputation of having a really strong culture. And what I found was it was massively coach-led. So in speaking to the staff and trying to kind of carve out how we might be able to copy some of the ways that they've transformed their group, it was amazing for me to find that actually it's led from the head coach, which ordinarily isn't as successful, but that's how they're working it, and everybody else follows. But underneath that, then they've got this development process in place where, you know, they drilled it out. It's in a lot of the leadership research that not everybody can be a leader, but everybody can show leadership skills. And once you take that stigma away, some players don't want to be a leader, but they can all display leadership skills and leadership behaviours. And I think when they're doing that, you've got that alignment in behaviour. And when you've got alignment in behaviour, as long as it's the right behaviours, you're probably along the process of developing a good culture.
Sure. So I guess the uniqueness of the military is we have a very rich organisational culture which has been born from centuries of, you know, battlefield sacrifice and a very traditional organisation. That brings with it immense pride in the people who serve and very strong value base. So it's a great organisational culture to walk into. But what it also brings is some very significant challenges because people are very wedded to some of those values and traditions. So when we start talking about organisational change, it can be very difficult to transition new initiatives and innovation because that change is also very confronting for a traditional and hierarchical organisation. So when we talk about our different levels of command, you know, we've generally got 3 key levels of command, which is our strategic, operational and tactical levels of command. And, you know, when we talk about leadership's fundamental to all of those levels of command, but so is the ability to be able to have a voice and be able to express that within each of your different areas. So, you know, we have unit cultures, we have team cultures, we have organisational cultures, and they vary depending on the different locations that you're in. The Air Force culture would be quite different to what the Army culture is. Air Force has been very platform-driven organisation. We've been very people-centric, and those different cultures bring different challenges as well. So whilst it's a very unique organisation to work in, it's also a very challenging one when it comes to that particular cultural sort of reform and how we innovate change within the organisation.
Aaron, you and I were talking yesterday, and you told me that one of your first days, I believe it was in Papua New Guinea, the story goes, it was basically you had 30 candidates walk in, they handed you the CVs, and they were locals, and you basically had to wean them out and teach them, I guess, what you wanted to do and how you wanted to go about your team and the structures. Must have been a very challenging experience to have those types of people from a different culture walk in, and you have to cultivate it from day one and begin managing it.
Yeah, I think it's respectfully, I guess, when we talk about culture, when you live in the Pacific, you've got the tradition culture and then you got organisational culture. And I guess the one thing that obviously I don't fit in, you know, I've never been able to walk down the street in Papua New Guinea because it's not safe for me to do that. My wife is Samoan, so that sort of got me in the door a few places because, you know, as a coloured woman, she can, you know, they relate to her more than me. So I guess going there I lived in the village for 12 weeks, you know, slept on the floor, ate tin fish and rice and things just to try to show them that you're not the typical white man. So, you know, respecting their culture, respecting who they are as a people. And when you're living in developing countries where, you know, we've had situations of staff being shot, staff being held up by machetes or whatever happens, it's you're creating an organisation that is trying to be independent of what's going on in society. And that's a sort of challenging thing that when I hear a lot of people, I come back to Australia, New Zealand or Asia, or people are talking all about medals and performance, I'm thinking, I'm just trying to make sure that my staff have got somewhere to sleep and what to eat tonight. And yet we can go and get a kid out of the village, and in 3 months' time, he won a gold medal on the Gold Coast at Com Games. And people don't understand those stories because they're so used to a systemised, structured way of performance, whereas we're just a human element approach to the whole thing. We get 97% of attendance at training because we offer a glass of milk, piece of fruit, tuna sandwich, and people think we're ridiculous when we talk about stuff like that, but we've often forgotten we don't have the entitlement mentality because they're not entitled to anything because they don't have anything. And it's one of the things that it takes a lot of time getting to know your people. We work with 36 sports in Papua New Guinea. In Solomons, I've only going to work with 28, so I'm a little bit luckier there. But, trying to get to know every person and understanding Melanesia, Polynesia culture, where the athlete might be in our program, but if the husband doesn't approve the wife to come to training today, she doesn't come, or she'll be beat up for coming, So how do you deal with those sideline champions and the other people around the athlete to really support them, creating that vision of what we're trying to do? If you I report to the Prime Minister, so if I'm trying to tell him that we're using taxpayer money to win medals, you don't have a job. You can't go with that sort of messaging. So we're trying to change the society and create some genuine role models in the developing country. And it's a totally different approach to what we've grown up in the very privileged society of Australia.
Kind of came from the opposite end to you, Sarah. I had to build a culture from scratch where one didn't exist. I think early on it was just about recruiting people who fit what I sort of wanted to do and fit the style. And that's easy when it's small. As the company's grown, that's become harder and harder. I don't do the recruiting now. So I have to try and, I guess, get other people to understand that. It's certainly something, and now, we're now talking about trying to have a consistent culture across 4 global offices as well, with different, they've got different cultures around them, but also just trying to spread that. And that's been we've done a good job of that. I think we've got a lot better at the last year or so, and a lot of that's been through good communication tools. Really embracing things like Slack and kind of getting that communication better. But it's still something that very much keeps me awake at night about the company now as it scales, is really how do I actually maintain that culture when I don't get to know what everyone's doing and talk to them every day and that sort of thing. And that's why I'm kind of hell-bent on working out how to measure it and track it, because that's my kind of natural data geeky reaction, is to just figure out a way to track it. So I'm big on that at the moment.
Way to segue into the next question, Mark. It's almost like you read the piece of paper on my lap.
I did this 2 weeks ago in Park City. So
the idea of measuring culture, some organisations will have something quite regimented. Some people might
See that a well-being questionnaire could be a way of measuring culture. Is there any methods that are currently being implemented in your organisations where you as the high-performance manager or the high-performance coordinator are looking to measure and quantify culture and then make actionable change against that variable? Is there anything in place?
It's a really challenging space to operate in, and it's something very challenging to measure. So, we're consistently looking at how we can measure these sorts of things to determine whether the interventions we're putting in place are actually having any success. The general position at the moment is, if people are buying into something, if they're feeling empowered, if they're feeling like they have a voice in the room, then we're probably hitting the right things, and we're actually allowing people to grow and for the organisation to grow. It's difficult to say so many things that we're implementing on a continuous basis that it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what element is actually having the success and what's not having the success. And it's really a case of trial and error. So if something is working, if the culture in a particular unit or a particular region or the organisation is a positive one, then we're doing something right. And then we really need to take an inward look and critically analyse, I guess, what it is that we are doing and what we've changed and what sort of statistical data we're receiving through that change to determine whether that can have a more expansive effect across the rest of the organisation. So Townsville's quite a unique organisation. It's a very sort of community defence relationships are very strong in that particular area. And we're having a lot of successes by branching out, not just internal to defence, but more within the community as well, and learning from some of our partners that we operate with, such as the semi-elite and elite sporting partnerships that we have in the region, and also our frontline responders as well, doing a lot of work with the Queensland Police Force, and learning a lot of lessons, I guess, from their culture and where there's similarities between what they have to do and what we have to do, and where there's differences and where we can learn from each other. The same way, coming to a conference like this, being able to learn from what you're all experiencing in a high performance world compared to us operating in a human performance space, there's a lot of similarities, and we just have to embrace, I guess, what it is that we're learning from all of those, and find those things that are really working and really connecting with soldiers to be able to continue to build upon.
Yeah, so we're probably in an interesting space there, that we've got a very young group at the moment at the Broncos. So I suppose culturally we're looking at elite behaviours and trying to teach a lot of those young guys to be elite professionals. So quantifying and measuring that, like you, Marcus, I like to try and quantify everything. But I think really what you're looking for is, have you got compliance or commitment? So I think as they start to get used to those elite behaviours and you start seeing them, well, I suppose as you stop having to drive them so much as senior coaching staff and the more player-led, I think you start to see a level of commitment there, and what you'll see then hopefully is an evolution of the standards and improvement and a player-led approach, which is, I think everybody's spoken about over the last 2 days here. A player-led approach, athlete-centred, is absolutely what everybody's driving for, but you can't develop that until you've got the right influences in the right place. And so trying to develop them from compliance level, where we set the standards and demand excellence, to a commitment whereby they drive the standards. I think that's how we'll look to quantify.
Across the different Pacific countries that we're in is two questions. We speak to if you're looking at individually, like staff, we always ask them, why are you here? Their why. And one of our key values is what we call servant leadership. It comes from a Christian ethos, which is that we serve, we lead by serving the needs of others. And because of, the Christian ethos through the countries and the servanthood nature of someone like Jesus or something like that has enabled them to think that you're not in these positions just to work and it's a job and you're a head coach or whatever you are within our system. You're here to serve the needs of others. So we try to make sure that we bring that type of community fabric into the organisation, but also then how our people, whether it's the athletes, the coaches or staff, connect back to the community. If they don't have a clear why, they're not engaged. Simple. And that's life. I think that's just purpose. Mental health is not a word that's used in the Pacific, and then come back here and it's like a buzz thing that's everywhere. I'm just like, you get what you focus on, and if you want more mental health problems, keep talking about it, because you're going to attract it. Whereas, and I say that respectfully, having friends in the military, that it is a genuine issue, but let's talk about your why, let's talk about hope, let's talk about your future. And the other thing with the servant leadership is it's not about you. It makes it about we're growing and developing you to help others, and the athletes are helping others through, again, the cultural way that Melanesia and Polynesia work. Is the employee of our organisation is not just feeding 2 or 3 mouths, they're feeding a family of 30, and the athlete in that village is representing a province, because at National Day of Solomons or Papua New Guinea they've waved 30 flags, not one. So when we understand the culture and the environment we're in, we know how to ask the right questions to know that we've got the buy-in. So at an individual level, if the families are buying into it, we know they're connected. That's how we measure it.
You mentioned asking your staff members when they come into the organisation their why. What happens when you find somebody that doesn't have an established why? Are you looking to work with them to establish that why, uncover it, or are they being maybe given other options inside of the organisation?
I guess being a bit of a troubled kid growing up, I learnt pretty quickly that some coaches will get rid of you just because you're talented. They're not going to keep you because they feel that you're not good for the environment. Whereas we have the approach that if we get rid of that individual person, coach, athlete that's not fitting into the culture, we took on the responsibility that it's our environment that can help change them. Because when I looked outside of our doors in the society that we live in developing countries, where else are they going to get it? So we felt, and that we don't say that arrogantly, we just believe in what we're doing so much that the changes in the young people, that we went from 83% of our athletes being unemployed, average education grade 3, the trouble that they were in on the streets, all the rest of it. And statistically, as that changed through time, we sort of felt we were connecting the right way. So if you take a real personal level, and this is the thing, it's, Mark just spoke about it, do you have the time to sit with your staff on a weekly, daily basis to ask some genuine questions? And if the first question's about work, you've lost them. So we make time to do that sort of stuff. And if it means putting yourself in vulnerable positions, going into areas that isn't safe, but you've got to go connect with the family to sort it out, you've got to do that.
I've seen a few clients around the place do some interesting stuff just by, say, subjectively to start with, adding, say, a couple of questions to, say, a wellness questionnaire or a checkout at the end of a day. So let's say you've got 3 or 4 defined, statements that define your culture. Let's say it's, sense of community, honesty with your peers, things like that. And then having people just even rate those on a, on a Likert scale or whatever scale you want to use on a daily basis as part of the check-in. The cool thing about doing that is even if, and some people say, oh, yeah, they'll lie, they'll of course say they did everything right. But the cool thing about doing that is at least it actually reminds them of what the core values are every day as well. So they're always going back to going, oh shit, yeah, actually I was a bit of an asshole today, I shouldn't do that tomorrow. So it at least reminds them, which I think is really valuable anyway. And then objectively, this is where I've got a buzz at the moment. Like I notice things like when I walk into our building, I can quite often tell, and again it's subjective at the moment, but I can quite often tell whether how the company's tracking just based upon things like the volume in the room, the activity levels. A couple of years ago we bought everyone the stand-up, sit-down desks, and even some days I walk in and everyone's standing up and they're huddling and they're talking, and some days you walk in and they're all down and everyone's kind of got their headphones on, and those sorts of things as well. And I think you can actually quantify those. We could even count that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for that. I saw some interesting stuff in the video space on that the other day that I can't talk about or someone will shoot me. But yeah, it's cool. So I think there's opportunities there, and I actually think that's a whole frontier that could be tapped into. I think it's pretty fascinating.
So when we're looking at your high performance structure that you guys have, more from a staff perspective, what is your style of managing that staff structure? Is it one that's hands-on to each key member of the pillars that you may have underneath you? Is it something where you're hands-off and you're just trusting it and you've got your task and the structure should take care of itself? What's your philosophy when managing the structure that you have beneath you?
Well, I think I've worked in multiple different clubs, like I said, and had multiple different, very different staff structures. What I'm seeing here now, I think that the way the game's grown, certainly in the NRL, we've got much more specialised coaches. Back in the UK, I think I would probably agree, most people are just a strength and conditioning coach. Over here, and in the US especially, you're a strength coach or you're a conditioning coach, or I think it's become much more specialised. You're a sports scientist. So when you got that sort of staff structure, probably last year I probably found myself doing a lot more management and just trying to make sure that the staff could be the best version of themselves. And so from a management decision-making point of view, we tried to use much more shared responsibility around making decisions. I think that's an effective management technique. It's certainly motivating for the staff to feel like we're making shared decisions. But I also think it's really important, I suppose a personal development for me this year is making sure that I'm coaching as well. I think head of performance role in the NRL and certainly in the AFL from people I talk to there has become a management role. I think depending on personality of those sorts of people, I think it can either be a management role totally or it can be management and coaching. And I think when it is that coaching side, it allows the better engagement with the athlete, which is, I suppose, my preferred approach. That's just my approach.
So I think it's, really we're talking about leadership, I guess, in our neck of the woods. So most of my team is here actually at this conference, and my approach is very collaborative. So I will always bring the team in and engage them in relation to any decisions that need to be made before a decision is actually made. There are times where that can't occur, and there's certain requirements reporting up the chain and down the chain that need to occur in the absence of that consultation. But if you know your team and you work together on a regular basis, then you instinctively know where the team will stand on a particular matter anyway. And more often than not, you instinctively know what the outcome or the response needs to be in relation to a particular problem set, and you're seeking confirmation through that team, but allowing them to have a voice as well as part of that consultation and collaborative approach to leadership. The greatest thing, particularly in an organisation that is built on such a strong culture, is allowing people to actually be part of that decision-making process. Because in a hierarchical organisation, often we are very good at telling people what they should do and how they should do it, as opposed to telling them what needs to be done and allowing them to find the way to do it for themselves. And quite often people will surprise you with just how innovative and ingenious they can be in the outcomes that they come up with. And I think that if you allow people to do that, you're going to get a much more diverse organisation.
I think a few factors, self-determination theory, people are going to do what they want to do. For us in the Pacific, we need very, very strong processes. We're starting with organisations where there are no people in country with any qualification to run the program. So we are starting from a blank canvas, and I guess we've had to have a very organic approach as to how we feel that the organisation should run versus how government, because again we report to government, we're in a government-funded program that we need to make sure that we also comply with those sort of factors. But ultimately, if we begin with the end in mind, I think Mo had that on his screen this morning. It's Stephen Covey chapter in his book, and it talks about that. We know what we're trying to achieve, and the ultimate about how we get there is being the most effective way we can do it. And I appreciate Mark's slide on the first day where he talked about the different segments of the organisation and where he's spending money. I mean, I feel guilty that every dollar I spend on something that should be going to an athlete or coach, because that's what we're here for. They're our actual customer. So we also have to think about the local taxpayer that has no schools, bridges, roads, schools, security system, and those factors influence what we do. So where we can empower the individual, and I know that as an expat that I'm redundant in a certain period of time that I've put it on myself, what we have to do to empower others is giving them a teams-based approach to everything that we do so that they understand the decisions, why we made those decisions, why we're doing it this way, so that we say, well, this is collectively what we all agreed, but you as an individual can self-determine if you want to buy into this or not. And that's a lot of trial and error. It's a lot of, I was wrong, you were right, coming down to that level. No job is too small for the leader. And if it's beneath you, you're probably not ready for leadership, really, because as a guest in their country, who am I to tell them what to do? It's about us as a vision where we're trying to take it.
I'm still trying to figure it out, to be honest. No, I mean, again, when it was small, when the business was small, it was. I always liked to let people run and innovate, and then because that's what we do, and I think that's really important. Early on, it's easy because I kind of knew what they were doing anyway, so I could let them run, but obviously not run too far off track. Now that we're bigger and we've got all these different functions, it's again, it's something that I'm actually trying to get my arms around at the moment. The key is having again, people like Sue and Leslie who actually do that day to day. I'm not actually a very good operational management person, but what it comes down to actually then again is data. It's about starting to track those things, track completions, track are we getting stuff done, and are we working? Are we spending our time on the right things? Like they say, making the main thing the main thing. It's a challenge.
Yeah, okay. So just bringing it under your own roof. So you personally, as an individual, is there any high-performance practices that you have to do on a daily basis to ensure that when you walk into the room and you're about to lead your team, that you're at your best? So the influence that you're going to have on your people is
the most positive and the best influence possible. Is there anything that you're doing daily that you'd care to share that might be of interest to people to make sure that when you walk into the room you're at your best?
Anyone who's worked with NRL players knows you need to take some deep breaths. I think remembering what it was like as a player has been a good one for me. So you have good days and bad days. You get dropped, you get picked. You can go weeks where you're playing in reserve grade, weeks where you think the coach hates you. I think having an appreciation, some I suppose emotional intelligence, and accepting that every player in the squad, they're the star in their own movie, and so they all deserve the same amount of energy every day. So we have a big commitment to making sure that we've all got our own stresses and we're the stars in our own movies, So making sure that when we turn up to training each day, we try, and I try personally to make sure that the one thing I always bring is energy. And so we've got some really good staff who absolutely bring energy, and there's no doubt that players thank you for it. They'll come and say to some of our coaches, "Thanks very much that you helped me today." And that's just having an appreciation that each of them's in a very specific position. Just purely thinking about football, that's not even taking in their outside life and stresses from families and kids and wives and whatever else. And just their football stresses. If we just bring energy every day, and that starts with yourself.
So I just need to remind myself to stop every now and then. Habit of, going at 20 mile an hour and, breathing, being in the moment. And the best way that I allow myself to stop on a daily basis is I always have to have a coffee. And the best way for me to have a coffee is to stop and to grab some of my staff and say, let's have a coffee. And it's a great opportunity to actually sit down and to connect with people and have a conversation.
I think I learnt probably the hard way when I started in Papua New Guinea. I was single and I worked 107 hours average a week, and I had 2 days off in 18 months because we had a deadline to get the setup done. And that was fine as a single guy where I didn't have any other commitments. But then when you look at the emotional toll that it takes, and yes, you get the job done and everyone's happy, then, family comes along and stuff like that. So I think one, for me, personal, happy to share, is just identity. I know, I make sure I know who I am and what I'm doing this for. And it's not about the job, the title, the money, the other stuff, because that's easy. You can go and do that anywhere, really. It's just more not losing who you are through that process, which sounds a bit fluffy and deep and meaningful, but the fact is that when you ask enough people in this industry that are 20 years older than you, if they're really happy with their life and you're really happy with your health and you're really happy with what you've done, what's the legacy you've left behind? A lot of people have said, look, if I was your age, I'd be doing X, Y, Z. And I think if you humble yourself enough to accept some of that advice from some senior people or mentors, it's genuinely serious, because I don't think the health of the people, holistically, that are 20 years ahead is something that they really took note of. The other thing, I guess, to me is making sure that you genuinely live the values. If you're going to do a mission statement, vision statement, values of an organisation, it's a heap of crap. There's no authenticity there. And I work in an environment that I have to prove who I am every day, because I'm not them. I don't belong there. I'm an invited guest. So they need to genuinely know, what are you here for? And if you know who you are and you genuinely, authentically live that out every day, you're there to serve others. You have that moment where you realise that I believe I'll be blessed in other ways because I've served others with what they need from me at this moment in time in my life. And having that balance and reality of, yes, it's about medals and yes, it's about winning, but not at the cost of human sacrifice. And when we live in a country where government's making a decision to fund stuff like this versus hospitals and schools, you absolutely need to know who you are when you look in the mirror. Otherwise, morally, you just can't live with yourself, the decisions that you've got to make. So having good people around you that can be honest enough to go, hey, are we on track here, or are we off our moral compass? We need to get back on that. So I think being lucky with having good people around you is really important, and taking that right approach. I
might ramble a bit here. A lot of coffee. No, B, I kind of I read a book a while ago, and you know, about sort of what's important about being a CEO, and because I'm not a business guy, I just became the CEO because I was the first employee. And at times I've wondered whether I should stay that as it gets bigger. Do we need a proper CEO? You know, do we need one that's actually like a business guy with an MBA and everything? Then I read this book, and it said actually the most important role of a CEO or any kind of leader is to be the cheerleader of the organisation. And I was kind of like, cheerleader? I don't know. Try throwing me in the air, that wouldn't work very well. But then I kind of thought about it, and a couple of weeks ago, Dave Martin did a presentation at a US summit, and he was talking about the belief effect, which was really interesting. It'll come out on video. We videoed it all. And that really kind of gelled to me. What it is really, it's actually about being that cheerleader. It's actually about being the one that genuinely believes in what you're trying to do, and then genuinely living that belief in front of your team every day. And I think that's absolutely the most important thing that any leader can do. It's just basically, because if you don't believe in what you're doing, why the hell would anyone else? So, and at times that belief gets shaken. It's not ideal, you know. There's days when I come into work and people just know not to even come near me. But I try to minimise those days and intervene, and whether that's exercise or coffee or whatever, and or just don't come to work that day. You know, like it's go work from home. But yeah, that's the most critical thing is bringing that belief effect, because it's so powerful. And I think that's actually more powerful than anything that I could have got from an MBA.